Two of the largest non-Western economies that are growing at the fastest rate are India and China. Note that they have liberalized their markets and opened themselves up to the international markets at a point in the 80s and 90s when their domestic industries were strong, when they could have faced international competition, when they did not have to destroy their local economies in order to get a few MNCs and get a few more jobs, and they did not have to subject themselves to political instability. That's a comparative that was clearly missed from opening government. 3 claims in this speech, I'm checking. First, you kill off infant industries, and that's bad. 2, common regulation in a country as diverse as Africa, in a continent as diverse as Africa, is impossible. Third, why comparative specialization, i.e. the best case of proposition here, still is a bad idea, and actually impossible in many cases. Let's jump right into it. Why do we kill off infant industries, and why that's bad? Let's first take a historical perspective on why certain countries such as South Africa or Nigeria are more developed within African continent than others such as Somalia or Zimbabwe. The simple fact is because of arbitrary factors of A, either having mineral wealth, such as Nigeria has oil, and other countries not having mineral wealth that they would tap into, or B, because of colonialism being less harsh in some countries, i.e. South Africa had a white population and therefore was not subject to as bad policies as a country like Kenya was, for example, right? This means that Somalia, Zimbabwe, or the Democratic Republic of Congo never had the opportunity to develop as much as South Africa or Nigeria had. In this instance, they have infant industries that are going slowly, right? Because you do have moves towards development, but they cannot compete with South African industries who've had 50 years to develop something, whereas Nigeria only had the past 10 or 20 years. In that instance, what you do is when you open up all of African borders, it's impossible for a country like Somalia, who just came out of a civil war 2 years ago, to be able to compete at all with Kenyan standards or Nigerian standards or even South African standards for that matter. But it's not just a case of opening internal African borders is bad, because you know, countries like South Africa or Nigeria, which have powerful, the more developed ones, are obviously going to have more bargaining power, just like the US does in NAFTA, or just like Germany or France does in the EU. What does that mean on our side of the house? That means South Africa's economy is dependent on trade, not in Africa, but with China and the US because it's more developed. In that instance, South Africa is going to lobby extremely hard for some kind of free trade agreement with the US, with China. At that point, an open African internal AU region is not just an internal open region, but it's also a free trade region to some extent with China, who can mass dump products at a cheaper rate with a higher quality, so it's impossible to compete with many African nations. In this instance, you kill off any support, any domestic industry that you have at all, right? We think that is a horrible thing that leads to mass unemployment. Also, it is unclear to me why certain countries such as, I don't know, Swaziland will be able to develop any infant industry at the point at which it can be outcompeted by 50 other states in Africa who will be able to compete better products at all, right? First claim, it is just horrible. Second, let's talk about common regulation and why that's, like, it's very bizarre, right? The PM says in their last minute, aha, country is good for all African countries. That makes no sense, right? Africa is a huge continent with diverse economic economies. Let's take two particular kind of common regulations you may want to impose. First, let's have a look at environment, right? Look, in South Africa or in a country like Nigeria, for example, which has mass oil production, will probably want lax environmental standards. Other countries who do not rely on mineral wells will probably want higher environmental standards because they can afford to do so. In our world, some countries have higher standards, some have lower, but they're suited to their regional economies. What happens on government when you have to impose one common metric on completely different and separate economies? Either you get environmental standards too low, in which instance, one, the environment is completely screwed over in a country like Africa, say like Africa, or they're too high, in which case, I don't know, a country like Eritrea, it cannot emit too much CO2, so it has to shut down all of its manufacturing jobs. In this instance, it's unclear why one particular metric or regulation applies to so many different and diverse economies. Let's have a look at that. Also, countries in Africa can't afford hybrid engines or other sort of environmentally friendly mechanisms, right? So it's unclear if South Africa gets its way, so why that benefits Eritrea. Let's have a look at a second kind of regulation, labor regulation. South Africa is richer because of your colonial oppression historically. It has a richer union history, right? That is not at all clear in the Democratic Republic of Congo or indeed in Rwanda, which have very limited unionized history. In that instance, some countries like Swaziland can only sell cheap workforce because they have no domestic industry or have limited resources to rely on. At the point at which you enforce higher workforce standard labor regulation, your cheap labor force is eliminated. So Swaziland can no longer say to MNCs, come to our country, we have cheap labor developed. They can say, we have nothing. So why would you want to go to Swaziland? The conclusion of that is, you would not want to go to Swaziland, right? It's unclear why one particular metric is A, enforceable at all to begin with, or B, even if it is enforceable, is a good thing at all. Closing. Yeah.
So that means that South Africa, for example, has comparative advantage and can less rely its economy on labor and rather to invest in Swaziland that, by your own analysis, has lots of comparative advantage with labor. So they have a reason to cooperate and to specialize in those.
I mean, that takes care of literally none of my regulation stuff, but like, sure, let's talk about comparative specialization. That's my third argument, right? Okay, best case on crop, as is just being pointed out by the POI, is how comparative specialization will work in a free trade region, and one African country will, really be good at one particular product, and another will be really good at something else, and everyone will be all happy and have the perfect economy. This assumes that any one country has the ability to specialize in one particular area. One, they have never proven to us why every single African country has the ability to achieve comparative specialization in one niche sector. 51 countries is a very big number, guys. They're also not very developed at all. A country like Swaziland has no industry to specialize in. It only bases its economy on its cheap labor force for MNCs to come on. That's not something you can base your comparative specialization on. The second thing, what are countries like Nigeria going to do when they have the opportunity to specialize? They're going to just specialize in oil or one particular industry. At the point at which you buy my first argument of having free trade agreements with China or the US, you open yourself up to international shocks. The moment Saudi Arabia does anything silly with OPEC, Nigeria's economy is destroyed. Look, the past 3 years of low oil prices to ruin Nigeria's economy. Third, you get political instability. For God to have any claim, some industries have to die out. That has to be their premise of their case. What does that mean? That means you get a mass scale unemployment. Look, in the US, globalization led to the white lash and led to Trump being elected. What do you think the equivalent is going to be in politically precarious emerging democracies, which have histories of colonialism, histories of civil and ethnic strife, histories of not being able to support themselves? That means you're going to get mass violence, mass riots at the state, because specialization happens over 10, 20 years. What's going to happen to the people within that time span? They're not going to just take your policy. They're going to be angry at why they can't do the same job they couldn't do before, why they can't have a living, right? Often, one small job means the difference between life and death, food and no food, shelter and no shelter on a daily basis. You get violence, mass unemployment, political instability in emerging democracies. Like, Africa is just too big for this to make sense. Proud to oppose.
Very much, and I would like to welcome Rita to continue their case.
Yeah. Ready? Okay. Yeah, okay. Concept that like Africa is too big so we can't do anything is just like a ridiculous assertion. Like, yes, the global world population is also 7 billion people. That's too many people to cooperate. Yet somehow we managed to do it. And this is why African leaders in the status quo are moving forward to have the free trade zones, which is like what is literally happening. So obviously the African leaders want this, and they probably understand the interests of their country quite well. And we here in Opening Government are here to re-explain those interests, which Walter's already told you. So I'm going to bring you 3 points. First of all, and more explanation of why we have more and better trade. Secondly, why this cooperation is positive for social and political interaction. And the third point about how this gives African countries negotiation power as a trade bloc. So those are kind of the things we've already told you about in OG. So I'm going to first just do some basic rebuttals. On this point about killing some infant industries, right? So they say there's going to be power and economic inequality within the free trade zone. A lot of their arguments hinge on like dynamics of free trade zones, which we observe in every free trade zone that we have in the world, and which still seems to work, given that these lead to economic growth, happiness, and basically like flourishing, right? So they tell us, like, okay, there's South Africa's really rich. Great, we think that any trading bloc has a leader. We don't think it's an issue for Mexico that they're in with NAFTA. We think that if you look at like Latin America, or if you look at Southeast Asia, there are obviously countries that are more dominant in terms of like their political power and in terms of like their economic advantage, and this actually gives a stabilizing influence to the trading bloc. Additionally, like smaller countries are able to like piggyback on the stronger economic and political relations of stronger countries, and this like, and that any union will have like a leader, and it's not inherently bad that there is a leader. We also like argue that the fact that you can get in on these like Chinese trade deals is a good thing. They're like, oh, they're going to be flooded with like free Chinese goods. why are Chinese goods so much cheaper than like African produced goods? Under our model, we're going to explain to you, and we have explained to you why there's going to be like, but make manufacturing possible within the African context. And much of the time, Chinese goods are so cheap is because like labor in China is quite cheap. Labor in Africa is also quite cheap, so we don't really understand where all these like free things are going to come from that are going to destroy the economy. We also think that, like, yes, some infant industries are going to be killed in some of the weaker countries. At the same time, I'm going to tell you more on my substantive why we get more industries in all kinds of countries, so like we kill that. And yeah, so deals with US and China positive. On this concept of common regulations are possible, like we believe that it's better off if the countries attempt to synchronize their policies. Yes, it's difficult to have environmental labor regulation. Once again, look at NAFTA, Latin America, Southeast Asia. It seems to work. Like for example, NAFTA has a separate labor agreement component, a separate environmental protection component. This worked out to regulate labor and environment across 3 countries, which have quite different standards and quite different emphasis on protection. So it obviously works, and to assert that it doesn't work to have regulation across different types of economies is ridiculous and unsubstantiated. And we think that even if regulation is like not going to be optimal, we think that it's better that these countries strive to reach mutual goals and to have like a mutual framework for what kind of trade is optimal and what kind of labor and environmental conditions are optimal. We think that the negotiation process is always a positive thing. Finally, on this point about like comparative social, I'm going to talk about that. And then this like political instability with short-term impacts. Like, yeah, I think that it's fine. Like any free trade deal causes like some unemployment, which causes harms, but it also brings quite immediate benefits in terms of like cheaper goods, more access to services, more access to jobs. And we think that as we have seen in every country that has signed a free trade deal, this has been like beneficial. We haven't seen, even in fragile countries like in Southeast Asia, even in like fragile democracies like Latin America, we don't see that free trade deal has completely upended the social order. We don't see this like mass scale rioting, everything goes to hell. So we just don't buy that argument. Why is there more better free trade? Okay, this concept of infant industries, no country has any specialization. We tell you, how does free trade work? We get these multinational supply chains, right, that allow countries to exploit their competitive advantage. So it's possible to manufacture more products, develop industries, as well as get new industries. Why does that work? Yes. Because you can, for example, have like a cloth production industry where all you do is you print like some cloth that you like. This is a very small business, and you can export that to a country that actually has the ability to like build a garment factory, that has the ability then to export garments, right? So the idea that like all infant industries are wiped out is just inaccurate, because it actually means that like people can produce components that come into finished products, and they enter the supply chain and are able then to have this economic niche, which enables them to have more trade. Yeah.
Just following on from this point, is your case literally that all African or majority of African states should become entirely dependent on MNCs coming in rather than have any infant?
I think that maybe they can form like multinational companies across Africa. Yeah, like I think that would be like a really good thing in Africa for them to have companies that that exist across state lines. Yeah, like I think that's great. You can have new domestic markets for developing components that then can be like traded across like state lines. This is in a lot of ways, like in Mexico and America, this is what works, is that a lot of products are manufactured across borders and traded across borders. That's why you take away tariffs. That's how you get more trade. Additionally, you use existing differences in infrastructure and political conditions. We both agree South Africa is really developed. There are some countries in Africa where like Chinese investment has allowed infrastructure, for example, roads and shipping ports that allow manufacturing to exist. That is never going to come to a small African country that has less political stability or has like less economic bargaining power, right? Those infrastructure is never going to be built there. So the smaller countries will never be able to develop this kind of international export industry that the larger countries have. So this competitive difference that they're so worried about only gets bigger without this active free trade zone. Whereas now, like even smaller countries have access to this infrastructure project so they can also export their goods and services. That's why it's better for the economy. So it's greater well-being for the consumers and for the citizens. Okay, it gives African countries negotiation powers like trade law. They get official representation, the ability to negotiate as an entity, right? This means that they can form more trade deals. And the point at which we argue that trade deals with other countries are a positive thing, we say it's better for like small African markets to also be able to have these like trade deals with larger countries. It also gives them more power in the negotiation process, right? Because they're a unified market zone. They can also get better terms and like easier kind of ability to change regulations because they're able to speak on behalf of like a multinational market that is often unstable individually. So bilateral trade agreements are difficult to form, whereas here they can have this larger unilateral trade agreement between with different countries and zones, and we think this leads to more trade deals, which is positive. Finally, we think this cooperation via the free trade zone is going to be positive for social political interaction. So this mutual bargaining that goes into the formation of the free trade zone allows countries to like work together. We think this is really positive. It strengthens of the African countries vis-a-vis the other countries. Businesses that reach across national lines provide economic and social stabilities, so you get this growth of industries across state lines and cooperation between the different countries that we think acts as a political and stabilizing force. That's why like free trade is good, because you know you get this like middle class, everything in the economy, all of the companies working together. Like just imagine everybody holding hands, access to cheap products, everything is working out. Oh my God, free trade is the best. Yes, it's so great. Please propose.
All right, thanks very much. And now I'd like to call on George to continue the case.
In a world where the TPP has just collapsed under the weight of its own problems, and in a world where the backlash to free trade more generally has just led to the election of a demagogue in the USA, it was charming to hear an opening government in this debate who thought that free trade was the solution to literally everything, and that free trade was this panacea to solve the world's problems. Apparently it's the case that there are 207 sovereign states in the world, and we all cooperate just fine at the moment. And it doesn't matter that there are 51 countries in Africa, because 207 sovereign states managed to cooperate just fine at the United Nations. I don't know if I missed the creation of the overall global government, which is miraculously able to cater to the needs of literally every single country in the world. Maybe closing government can tell me a bit about it in their speech. Our stance from opening opposition is perfectly simple. It's that the nuance and variety and different types of economies which are found across the African continent simply are too diverse to allow them to be regulated all simultaneously. We support the ability of individual governments to decide on a case-by-case basis what regulation works best for them. Note that that might include bilateral trade agreements in some cases. We're perfectly fine to say that from time to time a government might want to strike a trade deal with a particular neighbour in the event that they think they can claim some of opening government's benefits. But what we don't support is basically doing this all at once in the willy-nilly way they describe. I'm going to address political implications and human rights abuses, adding new substantive there. I'm secondly going to talk about why larger powers within Africa will dominate this bloc and set policy before clearing up some rebuttal at the end. So, in terms of political implications and human rights abuses, something which hasn't been touched on so far. Quite simply, what this policy does is cripple our ability to sanction corrupt, violent, and oppressive regimes throughout the continent of Africa. Somalia, Eritrea, Swaziland, Zimbabwe, the Democratic Republic of Congo. All of these countries have ongoing and profound human rights abuses, like the conscription system in Eritrea, which literally consigns all of their population to effective government slavery between the ages of 17 and 35. The murder of political opponents in Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe is literally able to have Morgan Tsvangirai, his main opponent, hit by a truck with no political consequence. And finally, the ethnic cleansing, which we continue to see in parts of Uganda and parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Why are these things so relevant to this debate? Because they tend to be perpetrated by very corrupt elite governments, which tend to derive most of their power and most of their income from dominance of the economy. Elites like Robert Mugabe are able to cling to power because they get money from particular sectors of the economy. Joseph Kony's able to finance his Lord's Resistance Army by selling on minerals, right? Robert Mugabe's able to cling to power in Zimbabwe because he's able to control so much of the mineral wealth of that country. What the elites do is basically leech off these particular industries and use the profits of that to pay their army, to pay their security forces, to pay off their political opponents. So in other words, without the continual stream of income from these industries, these oppressive governments are pretty much screwed because they can no longer maintain their apparatus of terror. What does this mean? It means that the best way to get an oppressive leader like Robert Mugabe to be able to some extent, liberalize and give up some degree of power and respect the human rights of their population is probably to threaten economic sanctions, is probably to say that we have the ability to bankrupt your industry, leave your elite poor and basically screw your ability to retain power in the long run. Because when the elite is poor because their industry is just being sanctioned, firstly that tells them they need to make deals with their political opponents in order to stay in power, because they're no longer in control of the whole economy. That means granting concessions to their political opponents, which basically means stopping killing them a lot of the time. And secondly, often just the threat of sanctions alone can be enough to reduce abuses, because Robert Mugabe is never going to risk being so profoundly sanctioned by the West. Look, you destroy the ability of African nations to sanction and root out corrupt leaders on their side of the house, because you've just guaranteed for the rest of time that corrupt leaders are going to be able to access a stable degree of income. Because no matter what human rights abuses they commit, they can still have access to stable things. They can still have access to the stable economies of the rest of Africa. That probably means no free elections anytime soon. That probably means, in consequence of that, a profound degree of economic development, because a very oppressive country which oppresses, which denigrates human rights abuses, tends not to be very good targets for investment and tend not to develop economically. They cripple our ability to fight oppression in Africa on their side of the house. Let's talk now about why larger powers within Africa will dominate this bloc and set policy. They've already conceded that South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria will dominate this bloc to a certain extent. And that's fine, because apparently America, having disproportionate power in NAFTA, has never created any problems at all. But why is this so important? Firstly, because it means that their free trade bloc will be exposed to savage international competition. Why do we know this to be true? Because the South African and Nigerian economies rely to a huge extent not on trading with other African nations, but with trading with the rest of the world. South Africa is a very service-based economy, so it wants to trade with Europe and the USA. Nigeria wants to be able to export oil to the USA and China. So in other words, South Africa and Nigeria are going to try and rig this trade bloc such that it trades with the rest of the world as much as possible. Why is that so important? Because it basically opens it up to competition from the United States and China. They say, why will Chinese goods necessarily outcompete African goods? Probably because China is the second richest government in the world and artificially subsidizes its state industries such as to outcompete all of its competitors. I will take closing.
Yeah, so the point about corrupt leaders, usually right now, they're not afraid of sanctions because all these Chinese are really happy to cooperate with those corrupt leaders. So we don't see where that comparative goes, and we're going to show to you that everybody goes on our side.
Well, I mean, I assume you're going to argue that African goes to your side. That's probably your job in the debate. But either way, look, on both sides of this debate, China, to some extent, can bypass international sanctions, although it has intention not to do that, basically, because the US tends to give it favors in return at the UN Security Council for voting with it. So, in general, like, China will largely align with the US on issues like international sanctions. But either way, look, it's about a comparison, right? If you guarantee Robert Mugabe access to the economy in South Africa for the rest of time, he's much likely to give up power on your side of the house. So, also, by the way, the reason why all their points on international capital and African trading bloc will be able to trade with the rest of the world, the reason all that's wrong is because it's still rigged by South Africa and Nigeria, who will just rig it so that basically can be completely open to other countries, which means the US and China can outcompete all of Africa's infant industry. Look, we support the ability of individual governments to make judgment calls about what is best for their own particular economy. A blanket policy is not appropriate for a continent of 51 countries, and on those grounds alone, propositions simply can't win this debate.
All right, thanks very much. And now we'd like to welcome to open the case.
Second, please.
Yes.
So first of all, our first attempt to this debate is basically to clarify as to how these perverse incentives of politicians work and how it is actually absolutely necessary for us, not necessarily to democratize those societies, but at least to achieve some level of pluralism, and how we achieve this by basically having at least some percentage of a middle class which will look for something else, which will ask for more rights, which will push back against these oppressors, and to say that the status quo and not our changes is something that keeps these oppressors on power in these countries. So some responses to this, how this will actually help these oppressors basically stay in power. First of all, major contradiction between two of their relevant points, right? First of all, they say we would like these governments to have bilateral agreements and to basically decide in the name of their people, right? Second of all, they claim to us these people are usually corrupt, very bad leaders. So now, if that's the case for these countries, it is horrible not to have free trade, because that means that you basically lock them into a society where their corrupt governments will decide who with will they actually trade and who with will they actually have any sorts of agreements. That means that they're basically arguing only for agreements which are beneficial for them, for the elites, and for their families and their friends, which is usually like several hundreds of people, which are extremely and obscenely rich in these countries. That actually means that for the most corrupt countries, this is the worst possible scenario that they can have. On that comparison, what we have now is a huge African trade bloc. Which that in turn means that you can basically open up your free trade and your basically your industries to plenty of other industries as well. What does this mean in practice? Like secondarily, what we say is when they say that these will effectively keep these strongmen alive and keep them in power, right? We already pointed out in his POI, when it comes to Chinese incentives, when it comes to incentives of other actors, right? They have active incentives to keep them in power, right? They say it's not comparative because that means that we'll have South Africa and Nigeria actively lobbying to open up this free trade agreement for the United States and China. Two responses to that. One, we say that it is not necessarily comparative if it is the case, because it is very simple that we now, in the status quo, have the situation where we have regional trade blocs in Africa, which are dominated by these countries to a much larger extent. Case in point, SADC, right, South African Development Community. Case in point, ECOWAS. We have regional trade agreements, which are dominated by Nigeria and South Africa to a much larger extent in the status quo than we would have if you would have like an all-African trade agreement. Why? Because plenty of other countries, they said 51, is basically are able to counterbalance power of Nigeria and South Africa to a much larger extent than they are in a situation where they're like 6 countries or 12 countries, because they have plenty of other political incentives to do so. That means that it is, again, not only a non-comparative point, but our point in this debate, because it will bring more checks and balances to these huge countries, and they will actually dominate comparatively less than in the status quo when these things come to mind, right? But also what we say is that on this comparison, it is quite simple. Free trade can help topple these regimes, but not necessarily topple, at least have some sort of political pressure and provide some sort of economic pressure for them, right? Why is this true if that is their main stakeholder? Because when you get first of all from free trade, that means that they don't have grasp on prioritizing what elements of economies are there to be important, right? But usually these politicians have as an incentive is to basically actively subsidize some of their friends and some of the other elites which are doing, for example, only 1 or 2 elements of industry. Like, for example, they are heavily subsidizing people that are doing agriculture because they have like huge swathes of country, or huge swathes of land in these countries. But we have by liberalizing trade, that means you have basically comparatively more niches and more options for people to start their own businesses, to people to find other niches and other ways of basically engaging with the economy. Because now they have plenty of other trade signals, and now they don't have to fear this sort of political backlash. And now you don't have subsidizing their friends and their elites, because that means that you are comparatively much more competitive against the friends of these political strongmen, right? That means that you have these people that arguably have more political capital in the future because you'll be economically stronger and more economically more important. So here's the important part as well. No, thank you. When they say here like international MNCs and basically how they will dominate MNCs and how this will necessarily be bad. We say this is comparatively much better again than the status quo, right? They say TPP basically failing had a backlash by Donald Trump, something we will just leave on. But the important part here for the comparative and for impact of this debate is we say that the good things from MNCs that we will get to a much larger extent, because now we trade as a bloc, which means that now we can counterbalance China to a much larger extent than Zimbabwe can. Now we can counterbalance Shell, for example, industries to a much larger extent than a very strong Nigerian government can do. So even Nigeria is very difficult to fight against such an international corporation, right? Why is this true if our plan works and if our plan succeeds, if we actually implement this? That's the truth, because now we'll have political subjectivity to fight off these pressures, because now we have political subjectivities to create more standards and better standards for our workers and basically garner benefits from them. Well, now we can say you have to invest in infrastructure if you want to bring money. Now we can say you have to have some labor standards if you want to bring money, if you want to come in our country, if you want to come in our country. Note that most of these harms stem from the premise, which was broken by me, that this will necessarily open up these countries instantly to China and the United States of America. The only warrant they had is South Africa and Nigeria. Pressure, I told you, is not only non-competitive, but actually on our side. Because that's the case, because we will not have this at once, that means that you will have more economic and political strength to fight off their pressures to a larger extent later on. Then they say, yeah, but it's basically labor standards, which means, for example, in South Africa, but in Swaziland, you don't have unions, you don't have a culture of unionization, which means in turn they will have like very poor jobs and stuff like that. First of all, what can happen is basically what happened to TPP. We can have universal standards which are going to be lobbied by South Africa because the unions in South Africa are very strong and don't want their standards to go down. That will actually can prove to be beneficial for some countries like Swaziland. Secondarily, it's not necessarily bad for the Ilya's already mentioned reasons. Go on, I'm sorry.
Can you prove to us why countries like Swaziland actually have the ability to meet these standards to begin with?
Standards, labor regulation. Like comparatively, they have much more chance to basically achieve those labor standards. In our case, because now they will have a universal standard law protecting them if we have this sort of community. The reason why this is be the case, because we have very strong unions in South Africa which will actively lobby their government to do so. That means that their consequences not necessarily happening, it is actually more likely to happen on our side of the house. When it comes to other standards and how it is completely impossible to regulate these countries because they are so diverse and so different, we say it is highly unlikely that this is the case to a large extent. Note that the only example they've given us is basically the ecology and how this will actually work. How this will solve in TPP, and we have no problem solving it again in Africa, is because they just basically said that they will not necessarily shrink the levels of ecological protection in order to be unfair competitors to the others. Now, this means that effectively you can skew some elements of the free trade agreement, and you don't have to liberalize everything in existence if some of the things are basically not something that is very beneficial for you, if there are like huge disproportions in some elements of the economy. Yes, it's a free trade area, but of course you can choose to which level will you regulate certain elements of things. Because this is the best for the stakeholder that they've said it's the most important one. Because all of the things that they said are either non-comparative, or at least a significant portion of them, or are better on our side of the house, it is I'm more than happy to propose it.
Thanks very much. And now we'd like to call Clara to open the case.
Madam Speaker, what we've heard from the other teams, somehow a utopia part Africa is going to be able to go ahead and save themselves. We've then had a total Hutchinson reenactment of how protectionism is going to save us all. Madam Speaker, what we specifically bring to you from our side is saying that Africa needs help from the outside. We're specifically going to focus upon the actors which are actively going to go ahead and actually promote and invest in these countries to begin to build up institutions that are actually going to be able to fuel the economy. We agree that protectionism, from what we've had, is the right way to go about with it, but we say this protectionism and the way in which this individual African economies work are specifically improved when we have other actors that go in and help them. That will be the extension. That is how we specifically specify. Okay, before we get into this extension, let's just quickly deal with what it is that we've written. First of all, we can test the idea that this entire African Union is even going to be able to work at all. That is all the information you've already got from opening of this issue, right? Because when we specifically think that these stronger countries aren't going to be able to go ahead and continue to dominate. Why is that? No, thank you. Because we think that countries such as Nigeria are much more needed for countries that are not usually used to be able to mobilize. We have some sort of idea that all these countries that really bloody hate each other because of all the civil wars that we've seen happening, that direct interaction and communication that we just generally have seen happening within Africa, these countries are simply not capable of mobilizing in such sense that they can stand up to countries that have always continuously appeared to be superior. We think that when countries such as South Africa and Nigeria, who are potentially derive a lot more from getting individual trade deals with other companies in other countries, can basically just tell you, no thank you, we will pull the plug. They have not as much interest of being in this specific union. No thank you. That is why they'll be able to continue to go ahead here and dominate. Let's just yeah, okay. So let's just like get into this entire idea why it's inherently bad that they're somehow like focusing their entire case on Ricardo's comparative advantage, right? What we're telling you is that a bundle of these African countries practically are exporting the same thing. We're talking like specifically about the countries surrounding Congo, where more than 85% of the entire production is things such as cocoa beans. We think this is inherently bad because you're suddenly forcing certain African countries to begin to develop niches industries that simply do not exist at all. Why is this particularly bad? No, that's because the countries that are a little bit stronger, such as for instance like Nigeria, is going to be able to then subsidize these certain areas, meaning they're going to be able to heavily outcompete the other countries that also specialize in the same thing, meaning we're literally destroying one country's entire way of exports for the others because there's not one country that can do this specifically better. That means you're leaving certain countries, such as Congo, without an ability to like they simply have to begin to like redevelop their entire economy and the way in which this was founded. We think you're leaving certain countries with no ability, no thank you, to go ahead and have these sort of jobs. Like secondly, we also think that like for if we call this comparative advantage, like even what you need to have a certain trust that certain countries will be able to provide the tech in which they specialize in. We think what we have seen happening with Africa, which have been like to a large extent certain corrupt like governments, where you're not going to be able to have this sort of trust within the government to provide a specific niche sector that providing. I'll take a few items closing now if you have one.
When it comes to subsidies, it can't happen because it's a free trade agreement, and this basically actually helps build our case, because that means that South Africa and other countries can't subsidize agricultural products. They're now destroying these economies.
Okay, great. We think it is even worse if these countries cannot go ahead and begin to just subsidize their economies a little bit. Why is that? Because that means that we're not going to be hugely less able to compete with the Western economies, which is why we predominantly want to be better. We think the Western economies already subsidize, no thank you, their products to quite a lot of extent. The only benefit African countries then derive is by making their products a little bit cheaper, which they then can do through subsidization. So either you go by them, and these like specific products are going to be far less valuable within the West, where Africa actually at one point, or you believe in what it is that we're specifically telling you, which is that you're destroying certain countries' economies. Let's just like dig into my extension. And then thank you, a big like why this bigger negotiation power doesn't think. Okay, essentially what we tell you is like Africa is a bundle of AAA plus loans pre-2008, right? We don't necessarily know what's going to happen with these specific countries because some of them are kind of unstable. No thank you. We think specific countries are going to have a much more greater incentive. If I, for instance, want to get cocoa beans, then I want to like trade with the specific country which I have that stability, which I will produce like exactly go ahead and like create infrastructure. We think this is like specifically no thank you when country like companies such as Nestle will seek towards other means, like such as for instance in South America, to receive the product that they really want. Why is that? Because somehow we see a utopia from coming here from government telling us that all these like countries will have certain demands that companies will have to meet going in here. Madam Speaker, certain companies do not want to meet these demands. That means you're actually making like Africa a worse trade partner because you have to live up to the demands of 50 countries, or you're going to get no benefit for the 50 countries that you're talking about. Meaning you're actually removing the investment from other from companies and from other countries for these countries. I think that is completely harmful. No thank you. Okay, why is it that like colonial ties, no thank you, are specifically important, the extension? Because these are the people that invest from the outside. The status quo is that we have countries such as France who have such strong ties that we're literally talking about them like, careful, they 85% of Botswana's assets. Why is that good? Because this gives like Botswana no thank you legitimacy when they're trying to get loans for instance, the WTO. But secondly, we also think that what this means is that France is more interested in helping out Botswana because they can get specific good trade deals within the countries that they previously colonized. Why is that important? No thank you. When certain French products are allowed to be sold cheaper within this specific region, and where they can like gain a benefit from it, they'll be more likely to invest for this specific country. But moreover, they're going to be more likely to go ahead and like, speak at international institutions, trying to talk against try to say we need to go and stop the potential civil war. Why does this stop? Well, essentially what we say is that when they can no longer derive a benefit, which they cannot do because you have all these products from all over Africa that can now be sold cheaper, France can no longer see a direct incentive to stay and have these very strong relations with this specific country. That means that for the individual country, you're no longer able to get that hand up that you so desperately need, the hand that you simply do not have in the international community, because you don't have someone to vouch for you. You don't have someone who will go in there and try to make your like infrastructure as stable as possible. What I think is far more important is that we allow certain countries to link ties with Western countries, so that this country can be built up, such as Nigeria is happening right now, when they're then interested in beginning to develop infrastructure all over the rest of Africa. Because when, as soon as they're rich, they might see an interest in you developing here, so we can begin to sell elsewhere. Where you will begin to see a benefit is by making the individual countries go ahead, give them a deal that can make them richer. Because you don't make everyone rich by making everyone poor. Thank you.
Alright, thanks very much, and now I'd like to call in Leah.
Moments. Panel, recognize that comparing this debate is not necessarily free trade versus protectionism, and apparently, like, we believe it's more likely the free trade with those Pan-African free trade versus free trade within bilateral agreements. Recognize that all big free trade agreements like TPP, TPIP, RCAP, and many others, like EU and Asian obviously, don't include Africa at all. There is no any single political will to cooperate with African countries due to lots of other issues. So it's a tipping point right now for African countries to become independent from some countries that are moving away their trade to other issues. So that is the question in this debate. There are three things that I'm going to sum up the debate in. One is going to be about corrupt leaders of failed states and the opening opposition like want to talk about mostly and think that is most important. Why is those comparative on our side? Secondly, about the dominance. Like comparatively, like dominance always exists from one side, like in each world. Like in our world, the dominance is much smaller and more compromises happen. And thirdly, why those regulations can happen and be beneficial for those things. There's just one extraneous point of rebuttal and closing opposition. Something about France and won't have interest to do so. Recognize it just because you have a free trade deal within like some of the countries doesn't mean that you as an individual country cannot cooperate with other countries or that they lose those incentives. Recognize that, for example, like Russia had before sanctions are lots of trade with lots of European Union countries like Poland and Germany. Recognize even Serbia is not part of the EU, has more than 45% of trade with the EU. So it's not the case that you don't have at all trade with the other things. Simply you have a better reasons. Secondly, usually moving out like France, their asset from Botswana is really expensive. They have lots of consumers there. They have lots of reasons to stay and be there. And actually, to apply to some regulations are going to happen. So we need to see much more analysis that's probably going to be considered as a new analysis in a way from why it's going to happen. Now let's see with the classes. Firstly, about regulations actually first. Now we believe that there is this assumption, this weird assumption from opening opposition, that some countries simply cannot meet regulations, like for example, Swaziland. We believe it's just false. Firstly, usually those regulations that are happening are not regulations that are so strict like European regulations. Usually they are forbidding something that's really, really harsh. Secondly, like for example, working for 15 hours a day or something like that. We believe it's just simply inhumane. Secondly, like usually those trade agreements need some time to like to decide those issues. Usually those need to decide either by consensus or by huge majority by 66%. Recognize that usually those working conditions are so terrible that we need to change them anyway. We believe this is the better way because usually there are some countries, there are lots of countries that have worse working conditions. Recognize that also they still have comparative advantages. Still, workforce in Swaziland is much cheaper than in South Africa. They still have comparative advantage even if everyone has lived their working conditions, like, I don't know, things about labor unions or minimum wage. We believe that those things don't change. Recognize that in the EU, like a minimum wage and things like that can differ from country to country. Like here it says 800, some countries have 150 or something like that. So those issues are usually really flexible. But secondly, recognizing the labor is really important because usually the strongest countries have really strong lobbies of the labor, like South Africa, that the George explained in his extension. This is completely unresponded. We believe it's highly important to actually push for those regulations, and it's possible to happen. It's possible to have those issues. About these issues about the environment, we simply don't care about issues because those issues are not necessarily comparative, and usually they don't need to be in agreements, as it is the case with only TPP. TPP doesn't say anything about agreements, and the only worry that I have is the countries are so diverse. I believe that, for example, Philippines, Vietnam, and not so similar countries, but they're still part of ASEAN, and still part of the huge free trade agreement. Just because countries are different doesn't mean it's not an argument for not supporting a free trade agreement. Free trade agreements, you need to be better at that. Second point about dominance. After that point, dominance. They say, oh, there's going to be some dominance for those countries. Firstly, that is false that only Nigeria and South Africa are going to be really dominant. Recognize that Angola has really powerful like banking industry. Probably they're going to be powerful agents there as well. Other countries like Tanzania, other countries like Egypt, etc. So there are many countries. Secondly, recognize that those countries don't necessarily have the same interests, and that is the comparative. If we only have regional bilateral agreements, usually Nigeria is the one and the only one actor, and there is no other big actor that has interests that are not fulfilled within Nigeria. So they counterbalance. Nigeria and South Africa, your panel, are really different countries, and they have some different interests. So they are therefore more likely to have some compromises. But moreover, there are also 45 other countries that are important. They need to decide those issues. South Africa cannot just push and decide something for all the other countries. I believe that there's much more likely to happen rather than bilateral agreements. It's like they only have 3 or 4 countries and that are forming right now when you see those dominance is happening. So the best is not comparative. Worse for them, it's much less comparative. It happens on our side. Furthermore, we believe, sure, opening.
So we told you that South Africa will impose burdensome regulation on all members of this trade bloc, making it much harder to do business in Africa. Your extension speaker actually conceded this in his speech.
Yeah, a regulation to some extent doesn't mean it's going to be really, really hard. Other countries need actually to accept it. We are finally having a little bit more regulation, but we are not finally South Africa ruling over the other African countries. That's also what my extension speaker said. We didn't listen to that. So it's not going to be pushing for, but rather to forming some compromises because of all the structural reasons I gave you. Moreover, we believe that as a bloc, they're more powerful to counterbalance the other countries. And that is where the third point about corrupt leaders actually kicks in. We believe that right now, they say that, like, look, if you're corrupt Mugabe, you can simply cooperate with China and have all those things sorted out. When asked that POI's opening position said, oh, but then it's not comparative. Well, they see what the comparative is. They say that Mugabe is going to have a free trade no matter what. Firstly, even in the free trade, you can still simply say, okay, you won't have access to things like common agricultural policy. This, for example, thing to happen in the EU. Recognize that for subsidies, something that also CEO run, you need to have money. In order to have money, recognize that most of those countries don't have money, and that's why they lean on China and the other actors. Right now, they will have money because they have some powerful countries that are able to push for something to subsidize things like agriculture, particularly agriculture, because usually some of the markets are overflooded by subsidized agriculture goods from Europe. Now, why this matters? Because this means that in order to use that market, you're still going to at least accept some of the regulations rather than no. So even the comparative goes on our side. Secondly, if Zimbabwe is subsidizing their own leaders, it's not something that is politically and economically sustainable for themselves. So therefore, they are unlikely to do so because that means they're going to be less successful. Furthermore, we see that lots of people can simply see that some countries that are doing the free trade are doing better, they're having higher middle class, and can see that actually they can work in their country, they can actually fight for themselves. Something that happened on Taiwan in 1970s, we believe that we don't see why it won't happen in Zimbabwe, or why it's not less likely to happen. So let's see what we got here and why we're going to proposing government. Firstly, regulations are possible to happen and they don't need to be really absolute. Secondly, dominance is much more and compromises are much higher. You need benefit from Georgia. And thirdly, corrupt leaders are at worst non-comparative, at best better dealt because other people can see that the middle class is thriving, and then they'll say methods that they use right now are not so sustainable. We're very proud to post.
Thank you very much to the whole government bench, and now we'd like to welcome you as the poster today.
being against the gov bench that generally just thinks that, well, we have tons of problems in Africa and all at the same time, but if we get a free trade zone, they probably won't just defeat each other, they'll just all be fixed at the same time. It's going to be magical, it's going to be great, we're going to do it all together, right? By being against them, it's interesting to be in a situation where they talk about all these economical benefits, all these political benefits, and yet they don't give us specific mechanisms on how these things don't actually will actually work together and become this magical free trade zone, right? What they give us is some sort of intuitive analysis on how, well, suddenly when they have these incentives to work together, then magically that all happens because, well, that happened, right? No, the problem is that the situation that we're in this situation is that we don't have any strong leaders in Africa that are strong enough and stable enough to take charge and actually be able to develop the African nation or the African free trade zone into something that can actually be whatever they're comparing to, they want to be the European Union, right? In this speech, I have a few things to do. I need to clarify some things, and then I'm going to go through the clashes, right? But what's important is, in this debate, all teams have agreed that the main actor and the main goal in this debate is to provide Africa with the development that they need, right? That's what we're doing on closing opposition. All right, so firstly, a clarification on Africa, right? So there's generally been just a few random names dropped out, but we think it's important to classify what actually Africa involves, because it involves a lot of diversity, and a lot of diversity that's very crucial to this debate, right? We think that there are three types of nations mainly, right? Firstly, there's the sort of developed, right? The things that we talk about in terms of South Africa, the countries that could actually become something soon, but aren't quite there yet, right? The second kind of nation we have is sort of like the puppy of the West or the East. Former colonial states, but also someone who are being taken advantage of by multinational corporations, right? For example, Nigeria, their economy relies on the West, on the multinational corporations, or former colonies who rely on their former colonial masters to be able to sustain their economy, right? They are not capable, they don't have the infrastructure to develop themselves. Lastly, basically the new ones, the Somalia who just had a civil war, right? That diversity is crucial because in order to create some sort of unifying agreement and unifying rules and unifying regulations, you have to accommodate all of that, right? Their solution is that they're saying, okay, well, they have to, so now they must do it, right? That's not a solution, and I'll get into that in my classes. We think that that's very important to know. All right, two classes. We're going to be talking about this situation and how to gain development in Africa in two ways. Firstly, we talk about how we want to get political development, and secondly, financial development, right? So political development was basically just, we'll have some countries who will be able to create development because they'll be able to take charge and they'll be able to, enforce and incite some sort of development, political development, or we'll create, no thank you, unilateral agreements on how there's some standard that we need to, and therefore Mugabe won't be able to lead anymore, right? We think that's problematic in a couple of ways. Firstly, generally the room agreed that some of the strongest countries in Africa right now, and some of the ones who will lead, are South Africa and Nigeria, right? So the problem is that some of these countries are not strong because they have a strong political system. In a moment. The thing is, South Africa is one of the examples of stronger political system, but still they have deep problems with corruption. Same with Nigeria, they are in a much, much worse state. They are only one of the stronger nations because of their strong financial relations with the West, right? So we think that them as role models in terms of political development is very problematic. Opening door.
Okay, but the comparative we offer is that countries in the status quo which have even worse politics and even poor economic prospects now will have the opportunity to diversify from trade and benefit from the success of these bigger countries.
Okay. Diversifying from trade is a very beautiful idea. Problematically though, the thing is that they have, right now, their economies are only suited to be able to do that one thing that either a multinational corporation wanted them to do, or to do that, or to do the thing that the only thing that they can, like that's Congo having cocoa beans, Nigeria having oil, etc., etc. They can't just suddenly diversify immediately, right? They need some sort of development, and that's what our extension is about, which we'll talk about now, right? So what we're saying, even in this clash, is that the development that they need politically, first of all, needs to come from the West, right? So we think that it's very important that a lot of these countries are former colonial states, right? A lot of these countries have strong relationships and strong ties with their former colonial masters. Sorry for the wrong term, but former colonial masters. And in those sense, these former colonial masters, they have an interest in making these countries stable, proper countries. No, thank you. And furthermore, they have an interest in making them proper democratic states. Why is that? Well, firstly, it's an inherent mission of European countries, which are most of the former colonial states. No, thank you. It's a mission of these countries to spread democracy and spread it in a way that, and more importantly, a lot of the Western countries who institute the democracy in these countries, they are able to, control it in the beginning and make sure that they get the benefits of the laws that they're getting. That incentive, as much as it is a horrible incentive, whatever, philosophically, it still provides development. It gives a stable, developed nation an incentive to develop this country. That's our mechanism. That's our extension, right? Moving on to the more important part. So concluding on political development, right? We don't think that Nigeria as a role model is suddenly going to make Africa a beautiful state without corruption. That's going to have to come from the West, from the strong, stable states who have influence internationally as well as in the country itself. I think so. So, moving on to second class, talking about finance, right? Firstly, main thing, right? We had free trade versus protectionism / bilateral agreements, right? So, first of all, we think that government bench, they say three things, right? Firstly, they say they need to, so they will, right? They need to develop, they need to diversify, so they will. Secondly, they talk about how they'll suddenly collaborate on a collective effort against corruption. And lastly, they talk about how, and then there's a main assumption, which is they have tons of problems, but they will all be solved immediately. No, thank you. Let me give a couple of reasons for why this won't happen, why this can't happen, right? First of all, Clara already explained to you why niches don't just suddenly, like service sector niches don't suddenly develop, right? It's not because Congo, they're already developed, they're already doing cocoa beans. That doesn't mean that they can suddenly just become the IT nation of Africa, right? We don't think that that's how it works. Secondly, we think that a lot of unstable countries will be in this major free trade zone, right? We think that that's problematic because they will be dragging each other down, right? The strength of a free trade zone is only as strong as its weakest member, right? The idea of the European Union is that when Greece fails, then Germany will be able to keep them up, right? The problem is that when most countries are unstable, that becomes a risk, right? That becomes a problem. Secondly, the cultural differences are massive. Why is that important? On unilateral agreements. That means that their value bases will be different, and therefore they will have different values on what is important. That is problematic, as opening opposition also explained to you, but mainly it's problematic in terms of reaching agreement and reaching sort of the unified front that the government rests their case upon, right? Best case scenario is that they gain some sort of trade internally, but without being able to compete with the West. They need the development of a strong nation from the West in order to be able to compete in the world. They need to be able to take it one step at a time. We can't just magically fix all the problems immediately. That's why we're proud to close. Thank you.
Please press the house. Thanks very much. And if you can step on for a few more minutes and give this one.
Yes.
Think about 3 minutes.
Bye-bye.